Hey everyone, welcome to another Power Monkey podcast. On today's episode, Chad and I interview Dr. Kelly Starrett. And many of you probably have heard or have met Kelly Starrett over the course of the last decade plus. Kelly is one of the most prominent PTs that we have within the CrossFit community, but he has also branched out quite significantly into the regular fitness world and has left quite an impact on what it means to be an athlete who is prepared. Through his best-selling books as well as through his website, The Ready State, he gives an incredible amount of information as to how to get athletes prepared for physical activity, as well as some protocols once injury occurs. I can't tell you how great it was to talk to Kelly. He's an incredible human being, so open, so honest. He's just a lovable guy that I know you guys are going to kind of want to hear more from. This is a really interesting podcast in terms of how we look at injuries right now, how Kelly's approach has maybe changed from when he first started within the CrossFit community over a decade ago up till now, how he got into the community, and kind of what his next steps are in terms of how to approach this subject moving into the next decade. I really think this is an interesting conversation. I love talking to Kelly, and I hope that we can have him on again, but hope you guys enjoy this one. Kelly Starrett.
Kelly Starrett, thank you for joining us, man. We're excited to have you.
Always a pleasure to hang out with the likes of you two.
Oh, man. You know, I've only been able to talk to you one or two times before. I don't even know if you remember that conversation, but, you know, I was telling you a little story about how I got introduced to you and started following you and stuff like that. And certainly, you know, I'm a big fan now. Let's get a little bit of the sappy stuff out of the way, because that's kind of what it's going to be here. You've paved the way for, to me, basically every PT in the community up to this point. You know, our Power Monkey PTs, Dan Pope and Dave Tilley, they do a lot for us, and they're great PTs. You know, Dr. Aaron Horshig of Squat University, of course, you've worked with him some and done some stuff with him. I work with him on a regular basis, and absolutely he'll tell you that you were a big reason why he does what he does and why he is where he is. And like I said, I'm a big fan. But I haven't always been a fan, Kelly, and I want to get this story out of the way, because I think there's some teaching points there, and that's going to lead us into some of the stuff that we want to talk about. Now, when I first came into the CrossFit community and started coaching, this was over 10 years ago now. And, you know, within that first year or two, I was coaching weightlifting classes at different CrossFit gyms. And one of the students that I had was also a coach. He was following your stuff. He was learning from you. And he walks up to me one day when I was squatting, and he says, you know, have you heard of Kelly Starrett? Have you looked into squatting with your feet straight? And I know you're saying, Kelly, oh Lord, I talk about straight feet all the time, but you know, he starts talking to me about it. He's asking me about it. My feet are probably not turned out excessively or anything. They're probably 10 degrees or something like that. No one's ever really told me to do anything different. And, you know, I've heard questions about this before up to this point as a coach in the community and teacher. And anytime I come across someone up to this point, if they have their feet anywhere near straight, I'm having them turn them out. And if I'm glad that usually people didn't question me, because really I wouldn't have had a good answer as to where I want your feet to be and why, other than it's just what I saw and what I told, you know, other people to do up to that point. And my answer to him was, no, I'll never squat with my feet straight, and I'll never have anyone else do that. I don't know who this Kelly Starrett is guy, but I don't care. But, you know, it was a turnoff to me, because I was coming from the weightlifting world, and there's this guy out there that is not from the weightlifting world other than, you know, weightlifting through CrossFit. And you're telling weightlifters to do this certain thing. And it was a turnoff for me. And I fought against that for a good number of years. And I don't even remember how many years, but at some point I had a guy move, or an athlete move in. You might remember him, Kelly, Adam White. I was a big fan of yours. He followed you. He knew your content like the back of his hand, and he's a great coach, by the way, and he still uses it. And he really opened me up to your material. And I had been, you know, seeing hints of needing to focus on people's feet and change their foot position for many, many reasons as a teacher and coach, but I was fighting against it until he opened me up to it. And at this point in my career, Kelly, for the last 5 years or more, I'm a straight foot believer. I preach it. I base my whole teaching and writings and everything else that I do on trying to get someone to be able to do a barefoot air squat with their feet straight ahead, full range of motion, great quality. And when they can do that, I believe with everything that I have, that one, not only their potential in the Olympic lifts becomes significantly higher, they become easy for them, especially when they have weightlifting shoes on, but just their potential as a human and as an athlete in any other regard. But it took a long time for me to open up to that, and like I said, I fought against it, and it's you said before we press the record button, you saw the future 10 years ago and what you were talking about was being able to perform basic mobilizations and PT on yourself at home. And that's kind of where you led everything. But I feel like you kind of saw the future on this as well. And so I kind of wonder where that came from, where that initiated from. But before we get to that, I want to thank you. I sincerely want to thank you for all the work that you put in all those years ago, that you've done for all the PTs, that you've done for all the coaches and for all the athletes in the community, and for all the work that you continue to do.
Well, let me say, first and foremost, if you want to understand how I think, go to your YouTube, Instagram channel and watch you lift and watch you talk about it. So, I mean, you've done such a good job of, helping people appreciate Olympic lifting beyond another half kilo on the bar, right? And I think what you bring up is this really interesting idea about what's our intention of training. Clearly you can lift enormous weights with your feet turned out, but maybe that's less effective if you're a gymnast, and maybe that's less effective if you're a child who wants to play soccer. Mm-hmm. And suddenly we end up in the utility of and the service of how do we take these best principles out of gymnastics and Olympic lifting and actually synthesize them into training techniques and tools that go beyond the individual sport, which is about output, right? Mm-hmm. Get it done. I mean, at least in gymnastics, there's some aesthetics built in. You have to turn out the rings so your elbows don't touch, right? You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Because that's a default. And so they built in some of the judging characteristics. But it's so interesting, the two of you, because gymnastics and Olympic lifting taught me everything I need to understand about the body that was missing from the language of physical therapy. Mm-hmm. And what's really interesting is that there's zero place to hide in Olympic style weightlifting, and in basic tenets of gymnastics. You cannot hide your compensations.
Right.
So if we get into the, Jefferson curl, good, bad, I'm like, well, what do you mean you can't flex and pike? Like, that seems like a really important position to be able to get into. And yet what we see is super uber stiff guys with wretched hip range of motion, just using, more weight to get their spines to round more, even though they can't. So that, it's so easy to misinterpret what these fundamental positions are and recognize them for what they are, which is such an opportunity to go ahead and find our incomplete range of motion, our incomplete movement capacities, and then turn the stimulus for adaptation into the diagnostic tool. So we don't have to do more silly BS. Because I remember, Chad, I've been to your gym. I think I taught your gym. It was in Killeen, right?
Yeah, near
a long time ago. Right, it was 115 degrees. You weren't there.
Right.
I drank 17 gallons of water. I changed my shirt 6 times and didn't pee once. And what I'll say is, it took us all a minute to understand what the goals were, mm-hmm. and the synthesis of what is best practice. How do these movements scale up from children? Do they overlap, or am I competing against myself, when I'm looking at athletic development and development across platforms? Because, what's interesting is, if you go to your channel, for example, you are really clear about, hey, if you want to be effective in these positions, here's your movement minimum. And mm-hmm. as a culture, we didn't really value that. As right. I just watched Athlete X or Athlete A, mm-hmm. Dave,
Yep.
And man, I'm like, it is about getting the job done. And, and some of that's built in. I'm watching the girls jump up and down with feet together, feet straight, beautiful arches, doing some of these basic positions. But the thing we valued as a coaching community, as an athletic community, was you go until you break, you back off, you go until you break, you back off, you get tortured a little bit more by your national coach, you back off, right? Versus what's the best expression of the human physiology? What's the best output position? Where do I get the most physiology bang for the buck? And it turns out those things are not incongruent. And as we have taken this step forward as a coaching committee, suddenly I'm realizing that who owns pain? It's the coach. Who owns movement compensation? It's the coach. It is not the physical therapist. Too far away, right? It's, you know, the gap between the squat rack or the platform or the high bar and the training table is too many steps away. Unless that coach is right there to understand what's going on, because they understand the athlete better than anyone else, right? Because, you know, if you are really challenging an athlete, then it's going to be heavy enough, hard enough, volume enough, fast enough, where you're going to see and understand what all of the movement tendencies are, what all the compensations are. That's why we have to do a better job of empowering people to understand what they're seeing. And it's totally okay to squat and Olympic lift with your feet out at first, right? But it's not an end road. It's always a process of skill development. And what we saw was a whole language and a whole culture of apologetics. Well, I have to squat this way with Olympic lifting shoes and a belt and my feet turned out. And well, I'm like, well, that's the only way you can squat. So I don't know if you're actually even at full native capacity. So I think we're getting better. And I'll be honest, I remember you in Attitude Nation, you know, talking smack. And I remember being like, well, I'll just wait a while. They'll get it.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I don't even remember that, to be honest with you. I know that, you know, people ask me about Kelly Starrett all the time, and it just, you know, I blew it off and like I said, fought it away. But I appreciate you not taking offense to anything that I said there. And I certainly have come around and, you know, just watching people move over and over and over again, and then experimenting on myself and coming to these realizations, you know.
Well, and let me just say that it's easy for people to drop into some kind of mobilization subculture where they like to mobilize and don't like to lift, or they like to mobilize and they don't like to do pull-ups or planks or, you know, torture paper. You know, and what we see is, man, there's a lot of functional movement and a lot of flow exercises. You know, I just saw one of our doctor friends, our carnivore doctor friends, is like the plank is like the functional exercise of like that where it looks like work is being done, but no real work is being done. You know what I mean? It feels hard. It looks hard, but you're actually not really progressing. How do I know? Well, we still see all the crappy spine control and inability. And of course, the ability to hold that midline spine position under some extension load is the big basis for other things. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying planking is bad, but as an allegory, we see that it was a lot easier to get on a foam roll and roll around than it is to get under a heavy front squat set, right? Yeah. Or, you know, show me you have basic control of your spine and rolling or gymnastics rings, or, you know, it's shocking how it's really easy for people to opt out of hard work really quickly and opt into things that look and smell like work. And I can see how that would be you're like, why are you talking about foot position? You can't even back squat 100 kilos. Like, what are, you know what I mean? You can't even muscle snatch yet. Why are we having this conversation? So I can really appreciate the frustration where and the only thing we care about is output. And output longer than everyone else. And so until we made that clearer, and I didn't do a good job of communicating, it was always about more power, more wattage, more resilience. It didn't matter, right? It was just another theoretical framework.
Well, I don't know that it was you didn't do a good job of making the points. I think it's just that most of us in the weightlifting community, certainly in the weightlifting community, weren't open to hearing what you had to say. And that's the biggest thing, is like, we weren't even listening. I wasn't even, you know, I didn't even give you a chance, you know, in the beginning. So I think that's the biggest part of it. But, you know, now foot position to me is everything in every way. It's the base of everything. You know, it's crazy. Dave laughs because he's probably annoyed about how much he hears me talk about it.
He's got contraptions. He puts people in these contraptions now to get their feet to be straight.
Yeah,
it's
he's like, oh man, I wish we wouldn't have had Kelly on now, because Shad's just going to talk about feet even more. But and to your point on the warm up, you know, I think, again, basing everything on the feet and what are your mobility limitations that are causing you to not be able to put your feet where we want them. If you are doing things in your warm up that are specific to that are specific to you, that are individualized, then you can get a great, very great effective warm up in 10 to 15 minutes.
Yes.
If you're doing that on a regular basis, that to me is all you need. The problem that I still have with warm ups is people spending, 30 minutes or more on just random stuff, on just stuff that is popular right now. What's the fad of the month, and that's what they're spending their time. And they may not have, they may
Couldn't
not
agree
need,
more.
yeah, they may not need to be doing anything like that. They may have, beyond sufficient ankle range of motion, for example, but yet they're doing something for their ankle or whatever that is, just as one example.
I saw, early on, Coach Bergner is, my sensei, and my basic route of understanding Olympic lifting. That was my way in through Mike Bergner. And I remember going down and working for him and watching 10,000 skill transfer exercises and just having my mind blown. Like, how as a young coach am I going to ever remember 10,000 skill transfer exercises? And as I was exposed a little bit to some, elite gymnastics through Carl Paoli originally, I remember thinking, I'll never have at my tool belt, all of the materials and all of the skills and all the drills that you have, Dave. I mean, you're like, oh, you can just come up with 15,000 ways to torture people in a million different ways, right? It's both you guys. And what I realized, and something to what you're saying, is that I saw a lot of corrective exercise, and that was the language du jour. And a corrective exercise is fine, but it's really a skill transfer position, a skill, exercise. That's why we're doing that. We do a corrective exercise because theoretically it's going to improve or carry over to the skill. Well, what I came out of a tradition is I actually don't use a lot of corrective exercise. In fact, I don't do any corrective exercise. My corrective exercises are the basics of gymnastics and the basics of weightlifting, but done with kettlebells or barbells or rings, or there's just so much richness to slow people down, to simplify the movement, right? Ring row, I'm like, what else do we need? Is that, good Lord, there's so much in there. And what I found was we were doing more and more corrective exercise, but people couldn't access the positions because they didn't have the range of motion. And so what we were doing was just hoping that all of these corrective exercise drills transferred. And certainly they do. And they're great. There's a place for them. And that's how you coach. Again, I'm agnostic. It's all about who can solve the problem the fastest to get the person to do what the coach is asking them to do. That is the goal, right?
Right.
But what I really fell in love with was this notion of position transfer exercise. So a mobilization is a way to give someone their range of motion back so that they can go do the thing that we want to do. And what I found was, if I did, I call it accessory conditioning, right? Which is, like get your breath, brain up hard, breathing hard, and then do all your, your pull-ups and your push-ups or calisthenics or the things that you need to do. You can do all of the bodybuilding accessory work hard afterwards, but the main thing that we need to do is what is the goal? Well, if it's snatching or if it's some version of a clean or a pull, that's the thing. And what I really wanted to get away from is I wanted to start cutting time off the training session, which was eating into the time of real work and skill development, and also time under real load. And what we saw was that people were doing more and more of this corrective exercise, and the world is full of just crazy amount of corrective exercises where I'm like, when do you actually get under a barbell? When do you actually hang from a bar? When are you actually doing the work of being an athlete? And what we see is that, man, it's super fun to do all these corrective exercises, face pulls, band X, get on myself primed. I'm like, well, you can do that, or you can, get under a barbell and an effective warm up, get into the thing faster. And that's the goal.
It's about priority. Yeah, go ahead, Dave. But it's just about priority, you know, and understanding what the true basics are and where you need to spend your time.
I think what I'm getting from Chad's initial talking point here was, we've seen in gymnastics world too that we've done certain exercises, we've done certain things a particular way because it's always been done that way. And that's one of the things that we were fighting against, right? Chad fighting foot position because that's just the way that I've always done it. It's the way that we've done it in the Olympic weightlifting world. Same with gymnastics, decades and gymnastics, even up to millennia of doing it a particular way. How do we change the mentality when it comes to, well, is doing it that way optimal for the athlete? Is doing it that way actually correct? Is doing it that way giving them quality of life beyond their ability to actually perform at one time? And I mean, we're recognizing that we've made a lot of mistakes in the gymnastics world with certain exercises, and that we need to kind of reevaluate and consult the PT world much more closely. And I think that's one of the things that we started to do much more of, is not only take the coaching side, but look at it from a scientific perspective too with the PTs and combine that knowledge. My question to you is, from just the PT side of things, have you noticed that your style and the way that you do things has potentially evolved from when you first started being a PT to now, in terms of how you look at particular movements as science has kind of started to evolve, or new research comes out, or has things stayed fairly standard as how you approach certain movements?
It's such a good question. And what I would say is, I want to just qualify that it's not PT, it's PT coach. It's the performance physio. It's the physio who also can get under the barbell and also can do a handstand and sort of understands those domains. And that's a really different conversation. Right. So what you're seeing is a generation of young physios come up who are also very competent coaches. And I don't think you can have one without the other. I think they both inform each other. And especially if you're looking at the development of someone from a child all the way up. I mean, it's interesting that I'm talking to both of you, because number one, you both have had the experiences of being young athletes and seeing your development continue up. And a lot of people have come to these aspects of the sports that you represent. Of course, you're much more rounded athletes than that, but they come in much later. And one of the things I ask a lot of people, for example, when I'm in big coaching groups, I'm like, how many of you actually have coached someone for 10 years? How do you know what your inputs and outputs are? Because typically no one has that kind of vision. And the physio coach hopefully gets to come in and see, hey, the reason we teach, kids to jump and land with their feet together is that it protects their knees and they're blocked in these positions. And then as they have more motor control and strength, we can move up their feet and create more sort of windows for more control and possibility. But all of a sudden you're like, well, why is that? Why are we out here when we're starting back here? And being able to see those fundamental movement patterns, fundamental skill sets, fundamental physiologies continue across the cohort from child development all the way up to the Olympics. And I'm not going to say that the Olympics is the best expression of non-dysfunction. Some of the most dysfunction I've ever seen is at the Olympic level, right?
Yeah, sure.
We're suddenly at a generation now where we as this young group of physios, like Aaron is a great example of just being so brilliant, but we are all standing on a generation of physios and coaches who didn't have this, who didn't hang out together, who didn't have the internet, who couldn't synthesize and integrate. And if there was a hallmark idea right now, it's about this ability to synthesize and integrate and apply, so we can start to see what is the minimum effective dose. So how do we simplify so we're not just adding more shit into the mix, which is what we used to do, just more and more. Now you're saying, well, what's essential? What movements can we drop out? And if I work with you, Chad, I am a beginner weightlifter that is so much better as a beginner than a medium, intermediate weightlifter 10 years ago. I mean, what your ability to get me to, without all the reps, to the place where I can handle the barbell and heaving snatch balance is remarkable. And what I would say is, I was lucky and fortunate that I think my best skill set is pattern recognition. And when I came into CrossFit, I was already a national team athlete myself, who'd been broken in the system, and that system was more volume. I paddled on the national team until my hand went numb and was retired from a cervical injury, right? And that was when I woke up and said, I just cannot work everyone anymore. I'm going to have to pay attention to these other things. When I discovered physio school, I was already working with Jim Schmitz, right? I was already beginning, I knew who Dan John was, and I was following Pavel, and I had these ideas. And then my first semester of physio school, I discovered CrossFit. And before we just, that's a loaded word, particularly right now, but 15 years ago, that meant I had to understand the rudimentaries of gymnastics and the basics of Olympic lifting.
Mm-hmm.
And, when we started this, you couldn't buy a kettlebell in San Francisco. Like, just let that sink in for a second.
Yeah.
Now you go to Target and you buy a kettlebell. So the world has changed. But early on, I started to ask the question beyond, why does all of this training, my experience as a national team athlete, paddling in the World Cup, why does that look so different than rehab? Why is this rehab language so different than the training language, right? Because something that you guys both have said is that, hey, it took us a minute to listen, but we're all products of a system that either listened and was progressive or not. We all come out of a coaching tradition, athlete tradition. And it takes a minute to see those traditions change and for the evolution to open up a minute, because, you were like, hey, this is how weightlifting is done because this is how weightlifting was taught to me. And it's going to take a second for those older coaches to move out and for the young physio PTs to get spun up enough where they can actually assist coaches in solving problems more effectively. It takes a minute. So to answer your question, Dave, there's a lot of things that I'm a lot more reasonable about now, I think, in terms of, I spend a lot more time talking about environmental health and psychological health and psychosocial health. Those things are a lot more important to me.
Right.
Nutrition, decongestion, more and more and more, like if someone has a pain problem, I'm like, all right, let me see your sleep. Like, that's one of the first things I ask now. I'm like, yes, of course you're overused and you're inflamed and you eat like crap. But I'm like, I need to see your sleep. And I don't believe you. So the things that I've changed, the fundamental principles, they're all the same, because I had this formal graduate level training in physical therapy, and that explained how the body worked, I would say that I'm like, how have I synthesized and integrated and made more essential? And if you go to my Instagram channel, you can see how I do a better job of talking about how to integrate this into practice. Right. So is there anything I'd backtrack on? I didn't make myself clear enough on knees out. What I was really talking about was foot position, right? And not losing your foot shape.
Right.
And your knee has nothing to do with that. So, you know what I mean? So, but I came out of a tradition where we talked about knees, not talking about feet.
Right.
So the principles are all the same, but we've refined what the minimum dose is. And I've done a much better job of saying, this is what I think you should be able to do. Why can't you do it?
Yeah, I love that. One of the things you said in there that I think is really critical, and I'd like you to expand on it a little bit, is the idea of the physio coach. Because, we get a lot of people who work with us remotely or through clinics, camps, whatever we do, and then go back to their own setting, would message us and say, hey, I have an issue. I have something that needs correcting. And we always recommend them going to see their PT. Now, the recommendation
that's
is
very generous of you.
Right.
But the recommendation being that a therapist that understands movement and a therapist that understands the movement pattern that they're doing on a regular basis in their gym, and a therapist that sees athletes that are doing gymnastics and weightlifting and CrossFit, as opposed to a PT that works with general population that really probably doesn't understand the movement patterns and the skills that this person is probably working towards. So is the recommendation, when you say physio coach, someone that is in the trenches and knows these movements well, so they can actually give better understanding of exactly what's going on?
Not only knows them well, but performs them, has some kind of practice.
Right.
Look, I'm 47 years old, right? I'm going to get my knee replaced this year because I put my femur through my tibia skiing a few years ago and I can't compensate anymore, right? So full snatches are out right now. But you're going to see me continually press under the barbell, getting to all the shapes I load, hinge slower, move. You're still going to see me doing all the things that I can do. I spend so much time working on my strict pull-up in as many different hand variation, grip variation, load variations as I can, even though I don't think you need to butterfly as an adult man, right? Those are sort of, I'm like, what's the goal? I'm not
likes that.
Yeah.
I'm not, I'm like, pull-ups are a poor sport. We'll just put it that way, right? So, but the idea here is, I still have a physical practice rooted in the traditional strength and conditioning model. And I think that original strength and conditioning model, which will include the fundamentals of gymnastics and barbell training and running and conditioning, that, you know, whatever it looks like, really good modern strength and conditioning, which is so, we're seeing it across all the universities, across all of the national teams. Everyone's training is getting more alike than it ever was before, right?
Yep.
Their eating is getting more alike. The sleep is getting more alike. You know, it's important that your coach or your physio not only is putting out fires and helping manage complex problems, but she is actually in the gym with you or with your team and knows your community, knows your culture, and knows the athletes. And that means we're going to have to drag physio along a little bit for a little bit longer, not give up on it, because there are people like Aaron who are just brilliant, and the physios that you work who are super brilliant at this. But we're going to have to make the case that, hey, we don't need you. And part of the revolution right now for me, you know, one of the things that I think I've expanded upon in that original thing, you know, I spend a lot more time helping people understand the nature of pain. And I really want to ask this fundamental question: who owns pain? So as an elite gymnast or a weightlifter, do you ever have pain during training?
Certainly.
Yeah. You guys are both like, oh, yes. And would I describe you as injured in those times? No. Training is by definition, we're going to be sore. We're going to have overuse injury. We're going to make a mistake. Tissues aren't right. All of those things. But you still trained. So what we've tried to do, what I'm really trying to do and help people understand, is that how do I define injury? I have something occult going on: night sweats, dizziness, fever, vomiting, nausea, like something like you have COVID. That is not a musculoskeletal problem. You have a bone sticking out of your thigh, right? It is a clear mechanism of injury. You landed wrong, you hyperextended, that's a clear injury. Or you can no longer perform your role on the team or in your role in society. Can't do your job, can't do your role. You are now injured. Everything else for me falls on the line of what I call an incident or incomplete mechanic model. And that is not a medical problem. That is a movement coaching problem. And one of the guys that I'm such a fan of right now is a guy named Perry Nicholson, who's a chiro, and his handle is Stop Chasing Pain. But he has an idea that pain is a request for change, which I think is such a powerful idea. And what I want people to appreciate is that pain is the same thing, same level of information as no power today, slow, you know, couldn't get my volume in, loss of range of motion. Pain falls into those categories. A swollen knee and a painful knee for me are the same, especially if I can still load, still do what I need to do. The problem is we did a really poor job in talking about pain in terms of problem solving. For example, what I mean is, if you don't sleep, go out drinking, eat pizza, don't manage your adaptation, don't walk, don't decongest, et cetera, recover, whatever, you're going to regen, whatever the word is, you show up the next day and I have an immediate feedback mechanism that you suck, right? You can't hit your skills, you can't do your routine, your balance is off, your speed is slow, your feet suck, right? And your coach is like, what's wrong with you today? Something's not, and then you're like, oh, I went out to a friend's bachelor party last night, and today I got this feedback mechanism. The problem with pain is that oftentimes we can't so easily conjoin those behaviors with a painful position, right? Foot is turned out, navicular bone is collapsed, arch is collapsed, knee is in, rotated tibia. I'm like, well, it just took a little bit longer for that information, that feedback coupling to come up. And why it's so important for us to have sort of some movement vital signs, the same way we know, look, if you're an athlete training, you need a minimum 8 hours of sleep, right? You need to eat whole foods. You need to feel safe. You need to warm up and cool down. You have to walk. Like all of those things we know give us the best output. Well, it turns out those things give us the best chance of having robust tissues. So we need then to be able to have coaches have a set of tools to be able to help their athletes manage really simple pain conditions. That may be blood flow restriction and occlusion. That may be gua sha and tooling. That may be cupping. It may be using a hypervolt. It may be using compression. It doesn't matter. Those are all tools to help desensitize a painful thing, which does not mean tissue damage. It means, hey, something is going on. It's a request for change. So the radicalness now is I want to unload all of the physio coaches from all the low level bullshit, right? Which does not belong on the PT table. If it's a painful condition that an athlete's experiencing, that's a coach athlete problem, not a medical professional problem. And what we've said for the last 20 years is, oh, you have pain? I don't know how to help you. I'm just a coach. And that is not true, because you're the only one who knows sleep, nutrition, sleep, stress, happiness, right? All of that.
Yeah, that's requesting on the coaching side quite a bit of additional education, right? It pushes the coaches.
How about it pushes the coach and the athlete, right? So suddenly the athlete's responsible for her sore knee.
Yeah.
So when an athlete comes in and, she's in the middle of a heavy squat program, which is what we need to do to get the stimulus we're after, and her knee is a little sore, I'm like, well, what have you been doing for it? And then like you're coming in with your problem, asking me to modify and change volume, but you haven't looked at any of the behavioral adaptations, or you have a voodoo flossed or compressed or decongested, or, so I think that there's a long ways we can go. Mm-hmm. And more importantly, as I said before, I don't think you need a whole bunch of corrective exercises. Mm-hmm. I think as a coach, you know how to scale the movements that you do. And they look in physio, there's only really two things we do. We either do isometrics, we stop, or we slow down. Well, it sounds like those are tempo and isometric holds, right? I mean,
that's our world.
Isn't that our world? So I'm like, why do I need a whole bunch of correlate corrective exercises when I can do bottom squats or pause, and I can either put a barbell on your back or I can put a goblet in the front of you? It doesn't matter. I can get you into a position where we can work on those positions, in those shapes.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that, Kelly. And I want to kind of take us back to, what we were talking about initially, in that from our perspective, it took us a while to open up and listen. There has to be, even still to this day, PTs that are still not listening to us enough on the other end of it, right? And I can only imagine, like you said, 15 years ago when you got in, and 10 years ago, it was surely way more. So I just want to touch on that a little bit and get your perspective on it, because when we first had Dan Pope come in to Power Monkey Camp, the first couple camps he was at, I can remember, and Dave Tilley as well, there were certain things that they had in their mind that they believed from coming out from PT school and their own experiences, that they were luckily for us, and they're the kind of guys that they were there to learn too. They were open to change, and they did change and adjust pretty quickly. One of many examples that I can give, Dave, I'm going to give a squat example, right? But, was, okay, Dan saw that even though he believed that at that time, probably that people shouldn't squat all the way down, Chad, as an Olympic weightlifter and a teacher of the Olympic lifts, he's going to teach these people and try to get them to go as low as they can possibly go with quality and all that stuff. So me, the PT, I need to learn ways to help him do that. When I come back to the next camp, that's what I'm going to do. And that's what he did. And that's how we worked together. And I learned a lot from him. Using that as an example, Kelly, how much of that do you still see in your world as a PT, and how does that compare to what it was 10 and 15 years ago?
Well, here's the allegory. 10 years ago, I went and spoke at the physical therapy combined section meeting. And I did a presentation, this big 3-hour block with 2 other physios. And there were probably 50 people in there wearing khakis who had never picked up a barbell in their lives. And I remember thinking to myself, I'm like, I'm in the wrong place. Like, this is not, I'll never change anything. And what I had a conscious moment there, because I was involved in, early CrossFit, where I realized I wasn't fit, I wasn't strong, I wasn't skilled in any of those things, right? That I was like, okay, I'm just going to go around. And 2 months later, Mobility WOD was born, where I was like, okay, I'm just going to not pay attention, So, Dave and Chad, you guys, come from a movement tradition, but I wouldn't say you're just an Olympic lifter. I wouldn't say you're just a gymnast. That actually isn't. You came out of a tradition of Olympic style weightlifting and gymnastics, but you aren't those things as coaches. I mean, yes, you're elite coaches there, but you also can coach anything else. I guarantee you can. So, what I started to appreciate was that, wow, I had this very formal education. I came out of the school, but I was going to have to create a parallel language. And fortunately, I had YouTube and I had Instagram and I had Twitter and I had all of these other ways to support and test my thinking in real time, because, we always have believed in this idea of test, retest, share. And all of the coaches, even, misanthrope Mark Ripito, you could get him on the phone and he would talk to you. You could go to his gym and you could pick his brain. Mike Bergner, all of the master coaches I was exposed to early on were 100% transparent. Even Greg Glassman was transparent in what they were doing and how they did it. And if you wanted access to it, you could go, Glenn Penley was in my neighborhood. I could just go over and lift with Glenn and, and Dave Spitz. And what was really amazing about that is that helped us create a model where we didn't just put some information in the world. We had to show up and make people better and help solve their problems. So test, retest, share ultimately became into a model is, does this movement model, and that's all we tried to create was a movement model. Does it explain what's happening? Does it predict future movements? And then can we share it? And that's what all good models do. They explain, they predict, and they're able to be communicated to other people. So, to the extent that, we're going to have to continue this. The physios have their heads in their butts, but there's a whole generation of young physios who speak barbell, who speak kettlebell, who have been exposed, who are watching everything you put out and really reconciled, what is it about the ankle that is it being exposed in this Olympic style weightlifting? Look, if you memorize the range of motion of the ankle, it's 20 to 30 degrees of dorsiflexion in a short lever position with the leg bent, right? In flexion. So like bottom of a squat. So I'm like, well, if you can't expose 20 degrees of dorsiflexion to your ankle, then you don't even have the basic range of motion that we all memorize in school. So, can't squat all the way down. I'm like, well, how do you, you're not even exposing that ankle to what it's supposed to do. And I remember understanding why the pistol was a thing all of a sudden. I was like, oh, it exposes full hip flexion and it exposes full dorsiflexion. I don't care if you can pistol. I care that you can roll into a pistol so you can get up off the ground, or you can lower yourself off a box, or you can get stapled under a heavy load, right? You and I are squatting, you hand me something, I have to stand back up with it. I mean, that's what we're talking about here. So when I started making the connection between what it is we were supposed to be able to do with our bodies, you should be able to be cold and have full access to your positions. You're not going to be as effective as being warm, but you don't need to activate your glutes and restore your range of motion. You have full turn rotation or not. Why? Because I noodle on it every day. But the physios never were trained to make the connection between what we were learning around base physiology and what that expression looked like when people were moving. That's starting to change. But just go around them. Don't wait for the physical therapist. Good Lord, no.
Right. No, absolutely. And I'm so glad it is. And I mean, you can see it with, the content that is put out by so many PTs in the community, and they're doing an incredible job. And it's making, as you said, Kelly, their coaches, not just PTs, it's making them super coaches, super teachers, and it's making us, all the other coaches in the community that are listening and that are learning from what you guys know and what you guys learn in school, super coaches as well. And like you said, I tell people all the time that, and I'm not saying this arrogantly, but I'm a better coach, weightlifting coach and teacher, just by nature of where everything is, Instagram, social media, the community, what we're all coming together, learning. What I've learned from Dave as a gymnast. I hate to admit that I learned anything from Dave, Kelly, but I have, right? What I've learned from you and other PTs and other sports, rowing, jump rope, all these things that come together and that we know from the human body. Not only myself, but a CrossFit coach that's 2 years in that is very interested and eager to learn might be a better weightlifting coach than some of our very high level coaches from 15, 20 years ago. And that's just the reality of it. And that's the great thing for all the athletes that want to be the best that they can in CrossFit or weightlifting or gymnastics this day and age. Even if they come into it pretty late, they have a big advantage to really work towards reaching their potential. Again, as long as they're open to open and willing to learn and put in the specific work that they need to make that happen. Now, we can't get off of this recording, Kelly, without bringing straight feet back. I want to talk about that a little bit more because again, I want to get your perspective on it. I want people to hear you talk about that a little bit more. And I've got questions, Dave. I'm sorry, I got so many questions here. Where did that initially come from for you? Where did that realization come in and you say, look, I need to start focusing on the feet more. Straight feet is what I'm going with. And also, can you define that for us? So for example, what does a straight foot mean? Does that mean for you that when we're standing with our body square, the inside of the foot is in a perfectly straight line and square with our body? What does that mean?
Yeah, I think if everyone who's listening is familiar with your work and your chalk outlines and your feet, those are the definitions of foot forward. And, ultimately I became interested in foot forward because, through motor learning, practice doesn't make perfect. Practice makes permanent. Like I've heard that my whole life, right? You play like you practice, that's why we're doing these skill transfer exercises. That's why I'm doing a million drills with this empty barbell, right? Mm-hmm. Is to learn and ingrain a pattern. Well, I was something like, well, if I'm turning my feet out to some arbitrary 30 degrees, which is right. Crazy that was what we told people. Because if you go out to 30 degrees now, you're going to be like, whoa, can you walk like that?
Right.
Can you dunk a basketball like that? Can you row like that? Can you ride a bike like that? Is that where you tell children to walk around like that? And oh, no. So suddenly what I started doing, and I think the genesis of this was realizing that when people turn their feet out arbitrarily, it was to solve a movement problem because it was easy to unpinge the hip and give people range of motion so they could achieve the task, right? It was a task-driven conversation. Yet it was really anathema to the conversation we had around break the bar, spread the bar with the barbell, right? In the bench press, something like that, like gripping the ground. Pavel talked about gripping the ground with an active hand and rotating the shoulder in, I don't know, 20 years ago. When was that thing? 18 years ago, 19 years ago? Mm-hmm. And so suddenly, when I was looking at people's arches and their mm-hmm. feet, I was like, hey, that's a foot structure that doesn't handle load very well.
Right.
And is completely shut down. And now I have a calf that doesn't work and Achilles that, and a knee that doesn't working great. And it's much more difficult to maintain the integrity of that foot with your feet turned out. Now you can do it. Why? Because I work in ballet. I work with Smuin and SFB and you have to be able to maintain your arch and your spinal positioning in this aesthetic development with the foot exact in the beautiful arch position. So we know it's possible, but one of the conversations, if anyone here isn't familiar with a guy named Franz Bosch, I would highly recommend you read his 2 books. The first book is like strength and coordination training. And it's really about appreciating that a lot of what we think is probably physiologic adaptation is actually neuromuscular efficiency. It's coordination and timing and motor control and motor learning, right? Mm-hmm. We're seeing more effective motor expression, and it's not necessarily because you're stronger, right? And so really looking at a lot of our things as coordination training drills as much as anything else. I mean, this is why if you want to learn how to jump and dunk a basketball, get a barbell in your hands, learn how to jump from a flat foot. Yeah. Like I guarantee you have to do all of that without always having a counter movement. You don't always have to jump, right? You'll learn what even foot pressure is. You'll learn what straight up and down is. I mean, it's just such a gorgeous way. This is why I'm like, every child I know should learn how to push press. I don't care. I mean, it'd be nice if they could jerk, but push pressing is the game.
Yeah.
And so his new book is called The Anatomy of Agility, and he's really looking at running sprinting as a platform for understanding what the anatomy says and what the principles of motor learning say. But there's a comment in there which is there's more variation in waltzing than there is in sprinting. And the issue is we saw a lot of people engaged in low-level activity, low intensity activity, low load activity, and you can do a lot of things in a lot of different variations and positions. You can get away with murder. But as soon as it's high load, high speed, right, high coordination, the tolerances start to go down a little bit. And what you start to see is, yes, if you want a goblet squat, turn out your feet however you want. If it's you just want to get fitter, whatever that means, you want to do more, you want to look good naked, it probably doesn't matter. Go ahead and get back to the gym and do all those machines, right? But if you want to talk about what the best function is, because what we saw was that when we got the feet straighter, and you and I are really alike. I'm like, look, somewhere between 10 and 12 degrees, we start to lose a lot of function in the hip. You just can't generate as much force. So what I ended up finding was that if we could coach to these positions, that we saw improved output, we saw improved power, we saw better control. The knees weren't slamming around. You know, one of the big problems that we see is that when kids jump and land, boom, that knee comes crashing in, right? And we know that women are tearing their ACLs at 6 to 8 times the rate of men. ACL injury rates under kids, 14 up 400%. Like, just choose a problem that you care about. And all of a sudden you're like, well, why am I putting people in a position that makes their hips work less effectively, and where they collapse their arch and they have navicular drop? And all of a sudden you were like, oh, well, what positions give me better access to my physiology? And it turned out that was a much straighter foot. And look, you're clever as a human being. You can turn your feet out a little bit, and you don't have to have feet straight. Maybe on the pole it is, but it's a slight turnout. You can, especially if you're Olympic lifting, you can open up those tolerances a little bit. Why? Because you're still powerful. But when you get beyond that, you'll see that we lose a lot of function and a lot of capacity. And the thing that I'm caring about, again, is not your waltzing, it's your sprinting. And again, if you turn those feet out and practice that position because someone told you to back in Vietnam, right? And you hold on to that, suddenly I'm like, well, you're not a very good sprinter. In fact, your Olympic lifting is making your sprinting worse. Your Olympic lifting is making your biking worse. Why? Because I'm teaching you when the shit hits the fan, turn your feet out, because that's your practice position. So when we started connecting the dots a little bit more, we saw, hey, when we got feet straighter forward, we had better arches, we had better hip function, right? And then all of a sudden you look around, like I just put up a video about like clamshells, and people's feet are straight when they do clamshells. And when they do monster walks, their feet are straight. Yeah. No one turns their feet out and does monster walks like that. And yet we weren't connecting the dots. So I took a very unpopular position and was like, hey, by the way, you don't have any dorsiflexion, any internal rotation of your hip, and by the way, your quads are super stiff. I don't know why you turn your feet out, but knock yourself out. And meanwhile, we saw fewer injuries, better performance, et cetera. So we make the statements based on the physiology and the anatomy and the geometry of the person and the wattage, output, volume, resilience. That's the game.
Yeah. I think 30 degrees is just, when you said that, I cringed a little bit, that turn toes out to 30 degrees. And I think that that's excessive for anyone and everyone. And, you know, one, I think things are better in general in this regard in the community,
100%.
But I think there's still a long way to go, Kelly. And I'm sure you see that and agree as well. I think there are too many people, too many coaches, too many athletes, and still a lot of PTs that are doing a great job in a lot of ways in the community, but they're still not making that connection. And the argument that I hear a lot, and I'm sure you do as well, when we talk about straight feet or a slight turnout, let's say 5 to 15 degrees, whatever you want to label it, is anatomy. Now, I have a gold standard that I write about in foot position for, to me, for every human, but for weightlifting specifically. And I know that, and you know, I don't know what you'll say about this either, but I know a lot of PTs and coaches in the community will look down on me for putting out a gold standard. And that gold standard is feet shoulder width apart and 5 to 15 degrees out. The only reason, Kelly, I say 15 degrees and maybe even 5, 10 for sure, is because I'm being lenient, and maybe I shouldn't be.
And we're Olympic lifting. We're got to get some Olympic lifting done, right? So what I do is I limit the amount of compensation that you have.
Right.
And we chase to improve it. Like we don't just arrive, because what you're saying is position doesn't matter. That's really what's the bottom. It doesn't matter what is that true, Dave? You can just do whatever you want with your hands. It just doesn't matter.
No, not quite.
You know, it just doesn't matter. Well, you know, you can just flare your elbows all you want. It doesn't matter. Yeah. Like, yes, it matters. It matters. So it's really strange. You know, I think the issue, one of the things that we see is I'm like, well, how deep can you squat before you compensate? Right. Mm-hmm. And that language of compensation compensation, and I used to use the word movement fault because that was the language I inherited. And now I say compensation, which is how you're solving a movement problem.
Yeah.
Right. And your brain's going to solve the problem. Because, look, if I want you in this range, but we're full cleaning, you don't have access to the position. You can't actually get down. So turning the feet out lets you get all the way to the ass to the grass. But as a coach, I'm like, there's something going on here. Like, what is it? But what we found was, if you never spent time working on it, and I'm not even talking about mobilization, I'm just talking about, really, like, you think you can dunk a basketball, turned out like you can't, and if you look at how people are jerking and how they're reclaiming their feet, they're, or that first push into the ground. I mean, the most powerful push is feet straight. I mean, straight up. So, or straighter, right? So what you're seeing is we get into this language of, hey, this is the sport. And the sport is you're going to get stapled under a heavy load in a full clean or full snatch. And I see that you can't even get into that position. And by the way, what are we even talking about? You're wearing Olympic lifting shoes, which are like high heel compensation machines. It makes it even easier to get the shape. So if you can't get your feet straighter with wearing a 2 centimeter high heel, I'm like, what are we even talking about? Well, we're talking about is that people never came out of a movement tradition that valued these shapes. They can't do basic forward tumbling. You can't tumble or do a forward somersault with your feet turned out like that. You just can't, And so what you're seeing is, man, the coaches at the high end or later on, catch people later on in life, found athletes and movers who didn't have a basic skill set. Because what you'll see is no toddler turns their feet out and slams their ass to the ground, right? No, it doesn't happen. And, if we look into the gymnastics community for children, why does Sever's disease show up, right? Why are we seeing all these heel problems? Well, it's 100% in kids who jump and land after those tumbling passes with their feet turned out and their arches collapse to the ground, bam, and that plantar fascia is pulled obliquely. Again, the speed, the environment, the load, it all starts to aggregate. And what we see is that it's not a dead end. What we're looking at is your ability to maintain your range of motion and skill is not a complete game. You don't win fitness. You don't win Olympic lifting. Even a gold medal doesn't say Simone Biles didn't just win gymnastics. She's getting better and better and better because she's still playing this infinite game. Our Olympic lifters now are lifting heavier weights, faster, in harder positions, squat jerking 200 kilos. Like, are you serious? Yeah. So, what we're seeing is that no one has arrived. And we're seeing that even, Ma Strength tags me and stuff. They're like, look at the feet on this, and it took us a minute to make our case. But I want everyone who's listening to appreciate this is a moving document. And especially if you're not an elite athlete, I want you to go in and use the thing that you like to do, gymnastics, Olympic lifting, cardio, as a diagnostic tool. Because what I want to do is free up your time. I don't want you to have to keep doing movement screens and movement assessments. I don't want you to wait around until you can't do your love. I want you to say, wow, today when I got warmed up with the barbell, my bottom position was a little tricky, or I worked on my handstand and it was a little tricky. Suddenly it's really easy for me to start connecting the skill for the day with the restoration of the position. That's what we're trying to do. Tighten up that. And
I think this comes back to something you mentioned earlier that I don't want to get and don't want people to gloss over. It's about athlete ownership. Yes. And it's something that myself and Chad and Chris and Shaw, we do a lot of stuff together with our capacity WOD. And it's something that we preach endlessly, that, we can be the guides for the athlete, but there has to be some level of athlete ownership when it comes to these movements and these skill developments to say, okay, I can be guided, but I also have to actually appreciate the movement that's going on, say what's going right, what's going wrong, and how can I actually internalize those changes from turn to turn. The athlete ownership component is absolutely critical for any athlete who wants to become better at these skills. So I think you mentioned it, but I don't want any listener out there to forget about it or kind of gloss over, because I think that part is critical.
And we have the tools now to really take a big crack at having our athletes feel, not just be told, right? And what you'll see is that as our coaches have gotten better, Chad, I've seen you coach. Like, you don't just run in there and be like, da, 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 da. You're like, how did that feel? you know,
Mm-hmm.
you know, the delayed feedback of knowledge, delayed feedback of results. I know you guys are master coaches, and the first thing you ask your athletes is, how'd that go? You know, and you give them a chance to internalize those feelings and express them back to you. And then you can, you know, work together on solving this problem. And it really comes out of this old patriarchal model, which was coach is master of the universe. Athlete does what coach says. That is not how we get best results out of anyone. That culture of fear, that bullshit needs to die. And all of those coaches need to die and go away. Did you see that there was a Rita Muin? It was a documentary about this Russian rhythmic gymnast coach.
Oh, I haven't seen it. My wife watched it yesterday, but I haven't seen it yet.
It's so hard to watch because you're like, oh, I know what this is. This is the old Romanian Russian way where you just abuse the athlete, get what you want, and then cast the athlete off if they can't perform.
Right.
And that model works. I'm putting quotation marks, but it doesn't unlock the potential of the human, where you are in an environment and an equal participant in solving problems and getting better. And it means that the old model of coaching has to be opened so that our athletes can feel. And the best test right now is shelter in place COVID. Let me know how well your athletes do with not being able to be in the same room as their coach. You want to find out what a good coach you are? How have your athletes progressed on their own for the last 4 months? That's what I want to know.
This is super interesting. I just want to bring up a little story because I think it fits in well here. We used to train quite a bit with the Japanese team. You know, we do yearly exchanges where we'd go to Tokyo and train at the Japanese Institute of Sports Science out there, and then they would come to the Olympic Training Center in Colorado Springs. We had a very good relationship with the Japanese team, and the coaching in the U.S. was very hands-on. You know, the coaches would be very much like, okay, turn to turn. How'd that one go? What's going on? Like, let's make these changes. Let's keep going. Many turns as possible. USA athletes are always like gung-ho from start to finish. More turns means better. We go into the Japanese gym. Athletes are on one side of the room. The coaches are on the other side of the room, like sitting down in chairs, just watching from a distance. The athletes take a turn, sit down, analyze in their own world. The coaches have minimal to no interaction with the athlete. It is all on the athlete to make a change. If the coach finally recognizes something that needs to be said, they'll come over and say something. It's a completely different kind of approach, turn to turn, practice to practice, where it puts the impetus on the athlete to understand what they're doing with their movement. I thought this to be fascinating. I looked at this as like, man, there's incredible value here, making sure the athlete understands what they're doing from turn to turn. So athlete ownership to me is because there was a moment that clicked there when I started to kind of see it the way that they trained.
Yeah, and I would add that you can't just arrive there.
No.
We need to start it. We need to start in middle school, right?
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
This is the perfect opportunity for every child in middle school to get a barbell, or elementary school, Chad. Sorry about that. And have them even have the language and the wherewithal and the authority, right? The permission to be able to do that. That's really radical because, coaches, that you're being shouted at. I never performed well with a coach shouting me. Like, I had a football coach and I had to pull him aside early on and was like, look, I will die out there, but you can never shout at me again. And, and he didn't. And we had this really incredible relationship where he'd be like, here's the problem, and we suddenly had this collaboration. And, he was like, he pulled me up after my senior year. He's like, I've never coached like that. It blew my mind. You had so much input into what was going on versus, shouting at some 14-year-old to be in the right place. So let's say that we have not arrived as a coaching community yet. We have a lot of work to do. And that experience is really powerful. And if you want a good example of this, everyone should look at the All Blacks. Nick Gill is the strength and conditioning coach there. He's one of my good mates. And the All Blacks are ready state athletes, and they use our stuff and are on the app. And towards the end of the week, as they get more and more prepared, it's on the captains of the team and the athletes to get themselves ready. And the coaches take less and less of a role because it really comes down to letting the athletes prepare. And it really speaks to the level of preparation and the seriousness the athlete does. That way the coach can be ally and can manage all the other things in blind spots, but they're not in charge of the whole thing. And
yeah, well, if something goes wrong, then you're looking for the coach, right? Where's my coach? Tell me what to do. If you can actually figure out those problems on your own, then you're at a much better place to make those changes as needed. So,
and now we're talking about the promise of sport and the promise of training, right? Which is, if E.O. Wilson, who is my hero, evolutionary psychologist, evolutionary biologist, says the highest calling of science is to improve the humanities. Well, I'm like, sport is our science. This is our laboratory. And the goal then is to transfer those lessons into our life. And if you teach people to be able to eat and sleep and manage their stress, and you practice over and over and over again, and how many times do you fail in training? I don't know, every single day, spectacularly, right? So that when you come up, you've practiced this and you have so much resource, and it's like having a superpower coming out of a coaching environment. And it's not an accident that athletes often go on, or someone who's had an athletic tradition go on to run companies or take big risks, because you get so good at it. And to your point, I want to move sports beyond circus. I want you to come out unharmed, that you can Olympic lift and not retire because your knees or your back or your shoulder. Look, injuries happen at high sports and high loads. I get it, right? We're imperfect, there's a lot of silliness that we can take off the table, and we can say out of these sporting traditions, this is how I became a better human being. So sport isn't just, circus. We can take those concepts and say, this is how we teach children to move so that they could spin up. I think one of the issues of physical therapy is that, again, waltzing, it doesn't matter, right? And they're like, it doesn't matter. Why are you teaching this? Well, eventually, when they hear that message at a high level of sport, it matters. And then we have to change everything again.
Right.
So it's easier to teach someone a better way that gives them more movement solutions, maintains their physiology, keeps their flexibility, allows them to learn more skills. That's just easier if we do that all the way through.
Absolutely.
Instead of changing something later on when I find it doesn't work.
Yeah, that's exactly what we teach. We say we always train everything to the highest level version of that movement.
Oh, I think that's so good. I'm going to steal that.
Everything that we do, we train towards. So when we're teaching someone a handstand push-up, we're not teaching to a handstand push-up standing up against the wall. I'm teaching you so you can understand the movement pattern that's necessary for the highest level version of that, meaning a freestanding ring deficit handstand push-up. So I'm teaching you always with that consideration in mind. Maybe we won't ever get there, but we're working with the stepping stool in mind to understand that that's kind of the direction that we're trying to work.
Well, can you imagine the other side of that? Because that is really exacting. And when you get the athlete buy-in, they'll make progress beyond their wildest. Yeah. But imagine, Chad, I'm like, you want to see my overhead squat? Watch this. I'm going to lean up against this wall.
Yeah. Right.
And I'm going to slide up and down up against the wall. And I'm like, well, you don't have to do that on a wall. You can just sit in a machine and press the machine over your head. Right. That's crazy. And I think that's where we lost our minds for a second, is that the gym became a very exciting place. It's easy to see progress, right? And ultimately, I want to use training for something else. I'm training, and frankly, gymnastics is a problem. It's not as big a problem as Olympic lifting, because Olympic lifting is a standalone sport. But we forgot why we were training. And if I'm not a gymnast or an Olympic style weightlifter, and don't get me started on powerlifting, which I think is amazing, really got people confused about what they were supposed to be able to do in their bodies. Sure. The goal here is, what am I training for? And if I'm trying to make a better soccer player or a better cyclist, then those conversations are skilled conversations, not just conversations about physiology. Otherwise, I'm like, dude, do Peloton, do some bicep curls, you're good. Go to Orange Theory and work until you puke. Awesome. You're good. But that's not how we get elite performance. And I don't know where this disconnect is, because, one of the things I think people fail to appreciate is, one is I coach my ass off all the time. So I'm always a user, right? I have to eat my own cooking. And then two, I get to go behind the scenes everywhere. I see all the sports and all the sport halls and all the universities and all the Olympic teams. And I get to see all the problems everyone's solving. And the fundamental principles that you guys are talking about are universal. And I think what we often see is that blind man elephant thing, where people are describing they're holding on to the tail and they don't know what's what.
Yeah, we were just in all that. We're really talking a lot about personal responsibility, and I want to bring it back in a certain way here, and then I think we can get you off here pretty quick. Kelly, I think Dave and I would both love to talk to you for another 3 or 4 hours at minimum.
I'm home. You guys are speaking my language.
Yeah, but that personal responsibility that coaches need to have, that physios need to have, but ultimately, most importantly, the athletes that we're trying to help, the athletes that we're trying to teach, the athletes that we're trying to coach, because without that, Kelly, you know as well as I do, I can be the best coach in the world, the best teacher in the world, but if you don't apply these one or two mobility drills over and over and over again for however long you need to do it, things just aren't going to change for you and go any better. And one of the problems I think there still is in the community to an extent is the definition of what fit is. You said it earlier, fit versus function, and those two things are quite different. I can come across an individual, a guy that can do, say, Grace or Isabel in a minute, right? But he's lifting with a rounded back. The bar's way away from his body. He's muscling over the top of his head. He's not dropping under any at all. His mobility throughout his whole body is beyond insufficient, but yet, my best time is just under 2 minutes. It'd probably take me 3 or 4 or 5 or 10 minutes right now because I'm out of shape. But even though my mobility is significantly better, my movement is better, the definition of fit says he is fitter than me. He is, and that comes with indications that he's healthier and that he's a better athlete than me. And that's not true. So in our community, you can be labeled as fit if you can get work done with certain amounts of weight or certain movements, if you can get that done quicker, more intensely. So I think that those definitions and those ideas are changing a little bit, but still not quite there, right? So that personal responsibility to recognize, maybe I can do even better if I work on my mobility. Maybe I need to think about health and longevity and that kind of thing. And with personal responsibility, I want to bring that back to, because with people that do have personal responsibility that I get questions on, and that I hear them say these things about, again, foot position, for example, straight feet or whatever foot position you're going to use in the squat or whenever you pull, anatomy. We talked about it a little bit earlier, but how legitimate of an excuse when we're talking about straight feet in the squat is anatomy, because you're going to hear a lot of PTs and teachers in the community talk about it. And specifically what the big one that they're getting at, Kelly, is the shape of your hips, abnormally shaped hips. One of the things that I do know that I can do with a decent amount of weight, now I don't try to max like this or anything, but Kelly, I can turn my toes in, 5-10 degrees and still set in the bottom of a squat just as well as I can with my feet straight or turned out slightly, right? So I know that someone with truly abnormally shaped hips can at least put their feet straight and they can at least work on that. So it's hard for me to accept this anatomy excuse that's being thrown out there. I do think there's some validity to it, and I do think that we can use it, but I'd just like to hear your take on that a little bit more.
So first, let me say that, when we started this experiment, 95 pounds and 60 kilos was a lot of weight, right? But what's happened is that sprinting has turned into waltzing. And what you'll see is that those conversations of someone who can do more work faster, right? Does it scale? Does that position handle and tolerate larger loads, bigger speeds? And what you see is that it doesn't. So it falls apart. The primacy of that position and that function falls apart under further examination, right? So yes, you can do it that way. And if the game is to move the barbell that fast, as fast as you can in that way, then let's nail the game. But if a coach says we're doing 30 repetitions and here are your movement goals, you have to stand up at the end of every rep, have your butt squeezed and feel your feet before you cycle your next rep, suddenly that I put an intentionality in there or a movement goal in there, and that becomes the standard. So that's a coaching problem, because if I value who went the fastest, that's what I'll get. If I value who does the most pull-ups, I'll get the least effective pull-up thing that looks like a pull-up, right? And that's right. So that's okay. But to your point, how are we defining, when we started this thing, no one was very fit, no one's very strong. Like the number of people who could, snatch 100 kilos was like 3,
Right.
and they were all Mike Bergner's athletes. And the first time I snatched 100 kilos, I was like, I am the greatest. And like, snatch 100 kilos? You mean like muscle snatch 100 kilos for 10? Like that's what people are doing now. So,
right.
So, we were limited in our beginnership 10 years ago and 15 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
I think people have forgotten where we came from. That none of us were very fit. None of us were very strong. No one could walk on their hands. No one could climb a rope. No one could, power clean effectively. No one, we made a video one time at CrossFit HQ, like the quest for 300 overhead. Like, are you fucking serious? Like, come on. Like that was a thing, putting 300 over your head. Like, stop, And, my 11-year-old can put 700 watts out on the assault bike. You know what I mean? I'm like, come on. So back then we were limited, and now we get to have a different conversation. So I think that's important. And then the second thing, which is really important, is, where people are looking for a reason why it's difficult, instead of looking at environmental health and foot position and range. Because let me just say outright, and I'll reference this for anyone who wants to know. If you go to the Brooke Bush Institute, Brent Brooke Bush is probably the best physio at integrating research right now and synthesizing research. And the research does not support radical changes in hip morphology across the population. That is a lie, right? And if you know anything about genetics, you'll know that, man, if you're a white person in the United States, you came from Northern Europe. All right. You have ancestors who lived in Scotland and lived in Ireland and lived in England not very long ago, and they moved around a lot. So we all have Scottish hips, and I'm pretty sure the Scots have an Olympic lifting team. I'm not sure, but I'm pretty sure they do. Right. So suddenly what you're seeing is, hey, it must be that I'm a unique snowflake. And there's an ideal squat position. I'm like, really? Because what happens if I have to lift this thing up and my feet are narrow, or I have to swing a heavy kettlebell? Or you'll see that I want you to be able to perform this movement in as many different variations as you can with as many movement options. So number one is the research doesn't support snowflake hip. It doesn't. You're not a unique snowflake. So that's not true. Second is that if you lay on my table and don't have full hip flexion or full internal rotation, external rotation of the hip, and I can change that for you, then it was definitely not the shape of your femur.
Right.
Third is that my wife, who was born with hip dysplasia and has now had 2 hip replacements, couldn't stand with her feet straight because it made her feel like she was going to dislocate. So what you'll see is that someone can't even stand with their feet straight if they have this morphology. They'll be like, kink, kink, right? So if you can have someone stand, because it is a ball and socket. And so if someone can't stand with their feet straight, you're not going to see a change in their orientation. And what you'll see is that people can hinge a certain way, ask them to perform a pistol and their foot doesn't turn out. And there's a whole lot of sort of errors in their logic around why they have to do this one movement in this certain way, right? And so the other thing that's really notable is interesting is that they always show you a picture of the femoral head, and they never show you what the acetabulum or the organization to the hip look like. They're like, look at this one thing. Obviously, that's the problem. Meanwhile, they don't show you how the hip itself has changed. They don't show you the rotation through the femur to the knee, and they don't show you the rotation of the tibia to the foot.
Yeah.
So what you're seeing is this one snapshot of the entire kinetic chain. And what you're telling me is that the human ankle is designed to work like this. And it's not. And what you'll see is, if this was the case, let's say it is the case, that means that we can't standardize teaching across any other platform, right? That when we teach kids to run soccer and do these things, right, we wouldn't be able to teach any skill. We wouldn't, because everyone has a unique snowflake. And because the hip and the femur are so similar, the truth must be the same about the shoulder as it is about the hip. Right? It's still a ball and socket joint. So there's so much variation in the shoulder. And we know that there's not. This is why we can teach people to play tennis and do certain things and certain skills, because the physiology of that. And if we go back in time, I guarantee you there's a smoking gun photo of a child with unique snowflake hips in a full squat, or playing on the monkey bars, or you know what I mean? What you're seeing is we have lost this capacity. we don't know how to get it back. We haven't empowered people to practice in those shapes and
Right.
positions. And so it's a lot easier for me to sell you that you have this unique snowflake hip. And with my special program, I will teach you what your exact squat width is. Like, I'm like, are you, what are we talking about? It's madness. So it's not true. And in populations where it is true, it's so obvious that it's true. Does that make sense?
Right.
Like, it's so, this is why our hip range of motion test, ankle range of motion test is to squat down with your feet together, just doing a double-footed pistol squat. That's our squat test,
Right.
because that's how we would roll up from a candlestick, or right. That's how I would lower myself down if I was getting off of a curb. And what you'll see is that's not the limiting factor. So when someone shows up with a unique snowflake hip, and they don't have internal rotation, and their quads are stiff, and they don't have any ankle range of motion, and they're unskilled, I'm like, maybe there's a few things we can address beforehand. But if you go to our channel, man, I love to poke holes in this. It's like my favorite thing. I'm like, oh, the apologists are out. Here we go. No. I'm special. You don't understand. I have unique hips. I'm like, I understand. You are special.
No, Kelly, I love it. And I try to poke a little bit here and there where I can as well. And, working on a lot of blog posts that I'm hoping to turn into a book someday. I mean, I've spent so much time and Aaron's working with me on that. So he's doing little doctor's notes in there. So it's been,
good.
It's been a lot of fun, but there's a lot of stuff in there that's speaking to what you're talking about in this snowflake principle and everything else. But it's just it's too much. You and I need to get together and do something to poke a little bit, maybe.
Well, what I see is, why aren't there are more cyclists than there are Olympic lifters? Why aren't they all like that? Right? Don't they flex the hip? There are more gymnasts than there are Olympic lifters. Guarantee it. Those kids aren't like this all the time. So, like, what's going on? Why is it that this one population has this problem?
Right.
Well, and I just want to point out that one of the reasons that I think CrossFit style training, when I say that, what I mean is you were exposed to the rigors of gymnastics, basic gymnastics, like fundamentals, right? Like level 0.5 gymnastics, not even like, and the rigors of Olympic lifting. And those are harsh mistresses. You can't hide your lack of rotation on the rings. You can't hide the fact that you can't press behind your neck. We had these positions and movements that ask for the human to show up completely intact. And the reason that and I'll just use those two traditions, are so excellent is they expose us to a movement practice that asks us to have normal physiology, actual physiology. It would be nice to be hypermobile, and clearly being able to hyperextend your elbow a little bit is an advantage, but that has nothing to do with the fact that all of these movement traditions can be done with average people with normal range of motion. And I mean normal, I mean full capacity, full ability. Because when you're telling me I should be able to squat my feet straight, right? We'll just say we'll give people the benefit of the doubt,
right?
And you don't have the ankle range of motion. I'm like, well, what are we even talking about?
Right.
You know what I mean? You have a demi foot. It's not even a full foot. So no wonder you turn your feet out when you run and slam your heel, and while you're slow on the bike, and you have that Achilles problem. So as we try to appreciate all the complexity of this, I want everyone to hear that the reason I'm such a gymnastics fan and an Olympic barbell fan, because they've taught me what I need to be able to do, because they're the best expressions of what full normative range of motion is of the human. And you don't have to be able to do a back handspring to be able to kick up against the wall and hold yourself up in a good position without going banana back, right? I mean, all of these things can be so scaled to your range of motion.
Absolutely. Kelly, we can talk about this stuff for hours.
You nerds, I love you people.
Yeah, and I think I love talking about it because I learn something new every time we discuss these things. But it's just so important for the everyday athlete to kind of listen to these things too and start to apply. But we are coming towards the end here, and we normally finish up with a couple of questions. So if you're up for it, you mind humoring us for our last few questions here?
Here we go.
Quick ones. First one's kind of important for us. Which sport or discipline do you prefer, gymnastics or weightlifting?
Oh, well, it's pretty easy. If you're an adult-sized man, there's only one sport for you. If your sport is dominated by 14-year-old women, it's not a sport. No, I'm just kidding. I'm
There
kidding.
you go. I like that. Let's leave it at that. Let's leave it at that.
I would say that I work my ass off on basic tumbling, rolling skills. I think I spend more time in those shapes, but Olympic lifting taught me everything.
There you go, Chad. Chad gets another check on the box.
I tell you
he
what,
hasn't had many.
No, but I am on a roll here, so I'm going to try to keep this momentum going. I've got to. I mean, we're at least 20-10 maybe at this point. So I've got a long
but wait, I just got to say this though. Olympic lifting is an incomplete movement practice. You don't take the shoulder into extension. The hip is never taken to extension. So if you're looking for a practice, something that looked like a basic movement practice with basic calisthenics and gymnastics would be better at actually exposing you, if you do Olympic style weightlifting, all of those things are programmed in by your coach. That's why Olympic lifters bench.
Yes. The diplomatic answer. I love it.
It is. And I agree. I tell people all the time, there's not a day of my programming that I give anyone that there's not at least one little gymnastics movement in there in some form or fashion, whether that's in the warm up or the accessory section. So we need to work everything together as much as possible. Although, Kelly, I liked your answer before you added that last little
Fair enough.
All right. Question 2. Is there a guest that you would like to see on our podcast? Anybody that you have spoken to recently, a book that you've read, somebody that you think would be a good guest for us to have on?
If you could get Frans Bosch, Dutch guy, I think he's most cutting edge. And then I would also put Perry Nicholson on your radar because he does such a gorgeous job. He's a strong athlete, coach, but talking about the importance of decongestion and lymphatics and health of your fluid system, I think could really improve the health of our athletic communities. I think that's where we make some mistakes sometimes.
Excellent. Love it.
Awesome. We'll look into those guys
for
sure.
Stop Chasing Pain. I'm obsessed. Like I stalk him, I Instagram him, I DM him because I just think he's talking about a tissue system, a fluid system, a movement system in the body. The brain basically prioritizes the body prioritizes the brain first, lymphatic second, and then musculoskeletal system is like 7th or 8th in terms of the whole system. And I just sometimes think, wow, if we take best practices out of some of these diseases, I think we could handle more volume and actually be fresher. That's what I think.
Yeah, with that stuff, it seems like we're only just now scratching the surface, right? I mean, it's going to be interesting to see how all that goes in the next 5 years because more and more of that information is coming out. It's just like with the nasal breathing, that stuff is more prevalent now. And we just had a couple conversations about that and have more plans. So lots of good stuff coming out through the community. And again, all this stuff coming together, working together that probably wouldn't have if it wasn't for CrossFit. So thank goodness for that. But last question here, Kelly, is kind of a two-parter. The first is, which do you prefer, reading a book, watching a movie, documentary, TV series, or listening to podcast? And whichever one you prefer, do you have a specific recommendation?
I really love reading. I am an obsessive reader, and I usually have 3 or 4 books going at once. And if I read a lot of trash science fiction and fantasy, and I read it on a Kindle because I didn't want to tear down another tree, but I obsessively dog ear, underline, notate, annotate in books that I think are important to read. And what's really interesting is it gives you a chance to put the book down. Sometimes with podcasts, people are so fast and there's so much information. It's hard to keep enough notes or to think critically about what's going on. But I read some of these dense works around motor theory, brain, or plasticity, or any of these things. And it gives me a chance to really pause and be like, what the fuck was that? You know what I mean? And then how does this make sense with my own experience? So, that's what I'd say is I'm an avid reader, and I won't bore you with my reading list, but I read wildly and I read variedly. I read as much as I can, and I probably not enough.
Nice. What is the more recent ones that you would recommend? One of the more recent ones.
I think David Epstein's new book is great. He wrote a book called Range, which is about being a generalist, which is really germane to this conversation because one of the things about your community, which is so incredible, is the depth and understanding of the people in this community that they have real range and abilities. They're generalists in Olympic lifting and gymnastics and movement and rehab and pain. And I think right now is the age of the savage generalist. And it's really nice to come from a tradition, which each of you have. But as I said before, the reason you're so competent is that you're so capable across so many domains. And that's what we're going to have to do. We're going to have to become even better. And I don't mean just you flirt with these things, like you understand really, really essential principles in each of these things. So I would say read Range if you haven't read. I think that's my current favorite book.
Awesome. I have not read that. I'll have to check that out. We're getting too many good recommendations.
Yeah,
it's going to take me forever
into my list
to get through these.
Savage generalism.
Mm-hmm.
There you go. There you go. Well, do you have any parting words for our listeners, Kelly? Anything you got coming up that you want folks to know about?
One of the things I'm thrilled about is the Ready State is we're relaunching our app in the next week or so. And we have a really, really good movement assessment I'm really proud of that can help you understand your movement more effectively. And again, if you're already part of this community, you probably have those tools. But I want to take what we've learned in our athletic communities and try to change the world with it and solve a lot of really low-level musculoskeletal problems. Right now, I have really come to appreciate and reappreciate that the gym and training and coaching isn't even about physiology. It's about my human connection. Yeah. And I really miss the gym. I miss hanging out with coaches. I went down to Jesse Burdick's gym last week and just did a little deadlifting there. And I saw like 10 people I knew, and we were all socially distanced, elbow bumping. But I was like, wow, maybe this has nothing to do with being fitter or stronger, or more skilled. It just has, I belong somewhere, and I really am missing that. And I hope we amplify those connections, because the Zoom is important, but being in 3D and being vulnerable to each other and accountable to each other and showing up and supporting each other, that's what this maybe is really all about.
Absolutely. That's always a great reminder. And I have to remind myself of that continually. And it's certainly true. I can, maybe squatting with your feet straight has to be secondary for me, right? So it's okay if you can't do that, as long as we have a good relationship. And it's certainly true. And Kelly, like I said in the beginning, you've done so many things for the community. You're doing an incredible job. You've done an incredible job. Look forward to, keeping up with you in the future and what you continue to provide to the community. People need to go check out that assessment. I know it's on point and going to benefit them in many, many ways. More ways than you can even imagine. So thank you once again for joining us. To the listeners out there, guys, be sure to head over to powermonkeyfitness.com for upcoming for services and upcoming events. We do have some Zoom sessions starting here pretty quickly, so hopefully you guys can jump on those or some other ones in the future. Also check out our Instagram pages for regular teaching and technical content at Power Monkey Fitness, at Dave Durante, and at Ollie Chad. And on behalf of Power Monkey Fitness, we're your host. I'm Chad Vaughn with Dave Durante. And until next time, guys, thank you all for listening.